Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the Cathedral on behalf of the trustees and the executive group of the Leighton Library. I'm Alistair MacDonald, and I'm a volunteer. We're all volunteers, and I slightly rashly volunteered to manage, and I use the term loosely, the restoration project. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a light blue sign on the fence as you come up the high street, which promises that the works will be finished by this month. And I'm going to have to alter that, but you'll find out the reasons why when you actually hear from the speakers. We always knew there was going to be a bit of a leap into the unknown, but there's a very interesting story about it, and I hope you'll find it a very interesting set of speakers. So we've got some very good speakers tonight, some real experts in their field. Just before we start, I'm looking around the crowd and there are quite a lot of library experts that I recognize. But just in case that we have one or two amongst us who don't really know much about the library, I'll very quickly say that the Leighton Library is the oldest purpose-built library in Scotland. There may be older collections and older personal libraries, but we've got the original collection in the original building with the original shelves and a lot of the original chairs. So we are a particularly unique treasure, and we'll hear from one of our speakers why the books that we have are so special, as well as having some very interesting architectural talk. The library opened in 1687 as a bequest of Robert Leighton, who was a bishop here in the 1660s, a very interesting man. And I hope you had a chance to see the portrait that Edinburgh University has kindly copied for us in the exhibition there. And the trust that still runs the library today was actually formed in 1701, which I think is an absolutely remarkable thing that the same body still guides the library. Now, interestingly, the trust document has been lost, and we can't find the title deeds to the library, but the trust soldiers on, and because we can't find the rules, they can technically do what they like as long as it's legal. so that's quite good. So anyway, we're going to focus largely on the works. Our building is 336 years old now, and an awful lot of things have happened to it in that period. And we're uncovering quite a lot of those as we try to get it ready for the next 336 years. So let's hear about that now. I'm delighted to invite our first speaker, Lord Robertson, George Robertson. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, who's very kindly agreed to be our patron. And we're very glad to have him after a significant career in public service. And we know he's a good local man. So, George, can I hand over to you to open our proceedings? Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. I'm sure I'm not alone among the group here in the cathedral tonight who have spent a lifetime in Dunblane but never actually walked up the steps into the Leighton Library. You know, we go abroad, we go to see cathedrals, we go to see museums, because that's what you do if you're a tourist, but you tend not to go to the Dunblane Museum, to the Leighton Library, or even to come in here to the cathedral. So it took me a long time to actually summon up the energy or the interest to go in, and yet it was a revelation to do so. It is quite a stunning resource for this community to actually have. I've always been interested in books, always loved them. Libraries have a special fascination, but the Leighton Library is undoubtedly very, very special by any real standard at all. 350 years old, and yet still here, and still performing the function that Archbishop Leighton designed it for all these years ago. But if it's going to have a future as distinct from the incredible past that it undoubtedly has got, then it's going to have the resources. The volunteers, the trustees have already done a magnificent job in raising enough money to start the restoration, and you'll have seen the the photographs of the work that has been done. And of course, as usual, even if a building is from 1687, the same principle applies that once you start working on it, the costs go up and the time scale expands. But money has been raised up to now, but more money is going to be required to finish it and to develop the Undercroft as a resource for the community itself. So another £175 is calculated to be required to finish that work. And more as well on top of that, if we're going to develop it and make the world available to see what we have here and what a precious resource is right here in the heart of our community. So one of the things that they wanted me to do, that I want you to do, is to make that contribution. This is a stunning turnout in a locality where the average public meeting would barely get 20-odd people. So it's people who are interested, but we want more than just your interest. We want more of you than just turning out for this informative lecture that you're going to get. So you got forms as you came in. You can sign up to be a volunteer because they are needed and people have done a huge job up to now. You can become a friend of the Leighton Library and make a regular contribution, and that would have a huge help in terms of the revenue stream that is going to be required to develop the library in the future. And you can also have access to the foundations and private family trusts that we know exists and that you know exist as well, who might be interested in funding something so precious to Scotland's heritage as the Leighton Library is as well. Despite the fact that you're going to be listening, I know to the experts who will come after me, I hope you will fill in these forms. You will give the information to the volunteers, because in that way we can make sure that this amazing library in Dunblane is known to a much wider community as a whole. I was in Peter Meldrum's shop the other day. Peter Meldrum has been giving out tickets for this event, but he said he wasn't coming tonight because it was past his bedtime. But his ghost is still here as well. But I want you at the end of the evening to take away the message that you live in a town that has got these very, very special key elements that need to be better known throughout Scotland and indeed the much wider world as well. And at that point, and having made that appeal, and I strongly appeal to you, I'll now hand back to Alistair, who will introduce all the experts who will tell you about the background to this magnificent, wonderful Leighton Library.
Thank you very much. I'm now particularly pleased to introduce Dr. Kelsey Williams, who's an associate professor from Stirling University in the Department of English Studies. We know him well because he has a lot of connection with the library and often brings students in to look at our books. And I've heard him speak. He's a proper expert. So Kelsey's going to just give us a bit of context about the importance of the collection, which, by the way, is in storage, in case you're wondering where the books have gone with all the building work. They've all gone to Glasgow, carefully wrapped in acid-free paper, and they're staying there under controlled conditions. The bad news, as Chris, our treasurer, will tell you, is it's 900 quid a month to store the things, and as our project extends, Chris gets more and more upset. But we can't do much about that, really. Kelsey, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alistair. I feel I ought to be reading you the first lesson. Barring that, however, I'd like to really ask and then try to answer this very simple question on the screen. Why is the Leighton Library important? Why does it matter? Why are we going to so much effort to preserve this rather small collection of rather old books? And I'm going to begin that with a bit of historical background, and apologies for those of you for whom this is already familiar. I'd like to begin with Robert Leighton, the posthumous founder of the library. Now, of course, all of this requires a caveat in that the man you see in that engraving is clearly not the man you saw in the painting in the halls earlier. One of these is, we believe, a real portrait of Leighton, and one of them is not. And I confess to not being enough of an art historian to know which one. But as the man in the engraving looks rather unfortunately like a slightly grumpy pug, I certainly hope that it is the painting who is the actual Leighton. Be that as it may, Robert Leighton was the son of a Dundonian, Alexander Leighton, one of those unsettled, pugnacious men so common amongst clergy in the 17th century, who was a minister in Newcastle when his son was born, in an independent Puritan congregation there, later attempted a career as a physician, spent a good deal of time in prison for holding violently radical Puritan views during the time of Archbishop Laud's ascendancy in England. At one stage, indeed, somewhat ludicrously, given the circumstances, petitioned the English government for the abolition of episcopacy. This will prove ironic later in the context of his son. So Robert, the son, though of Scots ancestry, we do not in fact know anything about his mother, probably Scottish, but perhaps English. Robert was born in Newcastle, south of the border, in 1612, and as far as we know, lived in England until he was sent to university in Edinburgh in 1627, at the age of 15. That being fairly ordinary in those days, university perhaps a little bit closer then to what we might think of high school now. The young Leighton graduated in 1631 and traveled across Europe, probably studying at some continental universities, as was quite common amongst Scots and indeed English students of the day. He was presented as minister in the suburban or rural parish of Newbattle near Edinburgh in 1641. Leighton was a kindly man, a man who disliked controversy. He was made uneasy by the politics of the civil wars. If you'll remember, by 1641, there's already military turmoil across England, Scotland, elsewhere in the Three Kingdoms, which will culminate in the execution of Charles I in 1649 and the Protectorate, subsequently under Oliver Cromwell. Leighton tries to lie low in his parish in Newbattle, but his natural talents forbid this. He comes to the public eye, and in 1652, he's part of a delegation sent by the Scottish Church to England to negotiate for the release of Scottish ministers captured during the battles between England and Scotland in the early 1650s. While there, and again feeling himself caught impossibly in the violent politics of his age, he tries to resign his living, but this is refused by the church. This will also become a pattern. A way out presents itself for him, however. In 1653, the University of Edinburgh, that stage youngest university in Scotland, offers him its principalship. He is already well known as a scholar and a man of learning in the church. He also serves ex officio as professor of divinity while there. While he was at Edinburgh, he urged his students, quote, to avoid that itch for polemical and controversial theology which is so prevalent and infectious, and taught a middle way in his theology and divinity lectures. In 1659, of course, Oliver Cromwell dies. His son Richard briefly succeeds, but in 1660 is the restoration of the monarchy with Charles II. That, in turn, means the restoration of episcopacy in Scotland, which had, during the period of the Civil Wars, reverted to a Presbyterian form of church government. During that restoration, there is, of course, a need to find some bishops where there were none, and Charles II himself pressures Leighton, somewhat against his will, to accept a bishopric at the time of the Restoration as one of the leading moderate divines in Scotland. Leighton is somewhat uncomfortable about this. He is not particularly firmly Presbyterian, but nor is he particularly firmly Episcopalian. He dislikes show, so he compromises with the king by requesting the smallest bishopric in Scotland. That, of course, is Dunblane. He insists on taking advice from his synod and allowing its members voting rights, which is rather unusual amongst the bishops of his age. But even with these attempts to reduce his own authority, he finds the political life of a bishop insupportable in an era so deeply divided amongst confessions and political allegiances. He tenders his resignation to the king in 1665. It is refused. You may begin to notice a trend. Under great duress, he accepts the Archbishopric of Glasgow in 1669. As one of the two Scottish archbishops, the other is in St. Andrews, he attempts to maintain harmony in church and state, but struggles with the increasing factionalism between the government and the Covenanters, that branch of the Church of Scotland, or that branch of religion within Scotland, which rejected the episcopal settlement and which increasingly became, to use modern parlance, radicalized and inclined toward terrorist activities. Leighton viewed the persecution of the Covenanters, which was the response to their terrorist acts, as, to quote, scaling heaven with ladders fetched out of hell. He makes 2 more bids to leave public life, and finally, much to the king's irritation, has his resignation accepted in 1675. After this, after his removal from public life at the age of 63, Leighton moved to live with his sister, Sapphira Lightmaker, at Broadhurst in Horsted Keynes in Sussex, which I think, it may not be coincidental, is about as far from Scotland as you can get without being in the sea. He lived there for the rest of his life, describing Restoration Church politics and everything he'd escaped from as, quote, a drunken scuffle in the dark, and died a little under a decade later in 1684. His posthumous reputation, then as now, was widely varied. Was he a saint? Was he a man who simply couldn't accommodate, a man who couldn't do his job? Was he not worldly enough for the positions he was put into? Regardless, he was one of the leading Scottish theologians of the 17th century. His work was widely reprinted well into the 19th century and was foundational for a great deal of the moderate Presbyterian and Episcopal theology of the era. So, why then is the library named after this man? Having been an active philanthropist throughout his life, he endowed bursaries at the universities and did various other charitable gifts. He added to the end of his will a small, some might say not entirely perfectly thought out, but vital clause, which is, only my books I leave and bequeath to the Cathedral of Dunblane in Scotland, to remain there for the use of the clergy of that diocese. Let's see here. Do you mind advancing the slide? I think the clicker is not wanting to behave. A lengthy process followed, in which sister and nephew Edward Lightmaker had to come up with funds and actually sort out the library. Leighton, you will notice, had not in fact left any funds for the maintenance of the library as such, simply the books themselves. Are there trouble with slides? No worries, no worries. The building itself then was built under the supervision of the then Viscount Strathallan, and the nephew, Edward, provided enough additional funds to support a keeper, a bibliothecarius for the library, and the books finally arrived in 1688. Then the library becomes, in the first instance, a place of reference for clergymen, for local gentry. Later, it's a subscription library at the turn of the 19th century. It buys in novels. It's popular with the water drinkers who come to holiday in Dunblane. Gradually, it falls out of use by the 1850s and is closed and neglected for 100 years. Thereafter, renovation and repair, it is reopened to visitors, as is now the case, save, of course, for the restoration. Would you like my slides on a memory stick? Is it possible they've been lost? No worries, no worries. There we go, that's got it. So that, rather wonderfully, is part of what you might think of as the packing invoice for the library, which miraculously survives in the National Library. It's the earliest record we have of the books as they were boxed up in Sussex and sent to Dunblane. So, there are then really two collections in the Leighton Library as it stands today. There's Bishop Leighton's own books, and then the books bought or donated over the course of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. These are also, or would be, were they in place at the moment, physically separate on the two long walls of the library. If you go in, you'll find Bishop Leighton's books to your left, the more modern books to your right and behind you. So what does this consist of, and why is it important? To go back to that first question, let's start with the Bishop's Library. What is actually there? What is there is a several hundred volume collection which was intended for use. A practical, working collection of theological, historical, philosophical books on a variety of topics, such to provide the background for an educated man in the 17th century. But what makes it particularly important is not the texts themselves, fascinating and rare as these often are. Over the course of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, books have been digitized in the millions. Books out of copyright, old books like these in particular, it's no longer the case that most of the time, well, 80% of the time, that a scholar need desperately search for a physical copy of a printed book if they want to consult it. As often as not, more often than not, you can find such a thing digitized by one of the major research libraries or Google Books or any of the other similar initiatives. So it is not the printed texts themselves that scholars now increasingly attend to when they're looking in libraries like these. It's the book as an artifact, the book as a material object. And this is where the Leighton shines. What kind of, when book historians talk about this, they refer to copy-specific things, i.e. not just the printing on the page, but the binding waste, scribbles inside, all of the things which make a book, even though it may be one of hundreds or thousands of printed exemplars of the same text, on some level unique. Perhaps a particularly nice example in the Leighton is one I ran across a few years ago, where the boards, the covers of the book, are made, as was sometimes the case, of recycled printed waste. In this case, the only known copies of an otherwise lost Catholic pamphlet printed in English in northern France in the 1630s. Similar cases could easily be multiplied. Here on the screen you can see 2 examples, fragments of a medieval manuscript reused as binding waste, and the binding stamp of a 16th century Scottish lawyer, otherwise known, I believe, in only one other example. So these are the things that 21st century book historians are particularly interested in, and the Leighton is quite straightforwardly unique and priceless in that regard. Its books have mostly, if not entirely, been untouched by later rebinding or other interference, and offer an incredibly precious record of what books were like, how they circulated, and how they were used in the 17th century. But also, it's important to consider the library as a kind of intellectual history, the library as a very rare example of the intact working library of a major Scottish intellectual figure from this period. In libraries like this, one could count on the fingers of one hand and have some fingers left over. Particularly the rarity of being able to recover in such great detail Leighton's working out. Many of his books are annotated, often in ways which relate directly to his published writings, is incalculable and has yet to be fully studied. And that is just Bishop Leighton's collection. The value of the other half as a record of a library's development during the 18th and 19th centuries is almost as important. A library for a region, a library like this, a place to donate valued family books, and latterly a place to borrow novels and socialize with Dunblane Society and its visitors, again offers us an incredibly important window onto the social and cultural history of Scotland in this period. So, why then is the Leighton important? It's a remarkably preserved, unique collection, the oldest public library still in situ in its original building, with no later tampering or interference anywhere in Scotland. It's a collection of major intellectual importance, because of the presence of Leighton's books, and one that is integral to the larger story of the book in Scotland. And it is also, and this is of particular concern for me as a professor at the university and as an academic and teacher, is a library for learning. It's an invaluable space for future scholars of the book to learn their skills. For the last few years, I've taught bibliographical workshops and done other teaching in the library with my students. And there's no alternative for this. This is a priceless and unique place for future scholars to learn their trade. So, and I'm conscious that I'm running out of time here, this really is a unique and a precious collection of national, and indeed, it is not exaggerating to say, of international importance for the history of the European book trade, for the history of European intellectual culture. And it continues to be, and will, I hope, for a long time continue to be, a vital resource for scholars from all disciplines working on this period and working on Scotland and the history of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, and we'll look forward to you bringing your students next year when we've got everything spick and span. Now, interesting speaker coming now, Rosalind Taylor, who is our architect. There are architects, there are conservation architects, and there are advanced conservation architects. And Rosalind is an advanced conservation architect, so we've got an extremely experienced and specialized expert managing our whole project. So, are you ready to go?
I think so, thank you.
Rosalind Taylor.
Thank you very much, Alistair, and good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see so many people here actually interested in this project. I'm going to say something about the Leighton Library from the point of view of a conservation architect. And the first thing to say is that I was really pleased when I was appointed to this, because I'd seen the building and I thought it looked a bit special because there's just a whole lot of little unusual things about it. And I've got some slides and I was going to show you some of that. So this is when I first came to look at the library, and you can see, just as soon as you see it, there's all sorts of strange little things about it. I'm going to try this pointer, yeah. You can see the big stones at the bottom. So you think, well, that's, you know, that tells you something about how old it is. There's a forestair, which this was a common feature in vernacular Scottish architecture in the sort of 15th to 17th century. It's got, go up to the top next, it's got two chimneys, but they're not quite matching, and it's got crow steps at one end but not the other, and then it's got this amazing stone. It's called a cartouche. So just as soon as you see it, you know there's going to be something, really something special to find here. So these are the other two elevations, and you can see that the one over here that's facing down the high street, you know, you're immediately conscious that this one has a different sort of chimney. The chimney's built of big stones. It's not been harled white. But all the other walls are hard with this white stuff. And unfortunately, you can spot one of the problems that you can see in the corner, that this harling is beginning to crack and fall off. And then at the other end, the striking thing about this elevation is that you never really see it unless you're in the manse garden. And then when you did, you saw that it was covered with trees. So what we had to set about doing, we were given a brief, and we were asked to really restore the building to being wind and watertight, and to, as part of that, to put the crow steps that we were pretty certain had been on the south gable back in place, and that would help with making the building much more wind and watertight. So the first thing we did then was we did a sort of conservation inspection, and what you do is you go around and you look at everything from the top down, and you look at its condition, and you anticipate what you might have to do about it, and start putting together a whole lot of information about what's wrong and what needs to be put right. And the thing that really stood out is this business of the harling. Now, when the building was built originally, it would have been, well, we know that it was constructed on the vaults, probably of something that was here before, because the ground floor is vaulted. And so there's this funny combination of some stonework that's already been there, and then they built up on top of that. And at that time, if it was a poor quality building, it would have had stones set together with clay. But right from the start, this has always been built with lime. So we know that from the start, although it's small, it's always been important. And if you can get into the little storeroom underneath the forestair, you can see, oops, didn't mean to do that. You can see under there, on the wall, you can see what looks like the very earliest and the only remaining bit of something that might conceivably be the original lime Harling. Because when it was originally built with this lime that would have probably been made from limestone somewhere in the area and fired in a big lime kiln with a whole lot of charcoal to make it. It was built and then probably, we think, covered with lime wash, in which they put sort of sandy stuff to make the surface more weather resistant. Now, the thing about lime is that although it's a fantastic product, it's extremely fussy about the weather. You know, if it's too cold, you can't use the lime or it fails. And if it's too hot, it doesn't like heat and it fails. And if it's wet, it goes wrong. And if it's too dry, it dries out too quickly. And if it's windy, that makes it dry. So lime really involves a huge amount of skill. So it would have been, when this was being built, it would have been built probably in seasons. You know, they stopped work completely for the winter because you couldn't use the lime. So, go ahead. This is going back to the elevation where we saw where the problem of if it beginning to fail. Now, this white lime that or what's called lime Harling that we've got on it now, was put on it in, we think, about the 1880s. And by then, they were using cement. Now, cement was discovered back at the end of the 19th century, and it required masses of heat to create. But by then, the Industrial Revolution had given us industrialists who could devise ways of inventing this cement. And cement became cheaper, so that by the post-First World War, when there was a shortage of skilled people, it was just natural for everyone to start using cement, because cement, it works when the temperature drops, it still works. The sun comes out, it still works, because it takes its set so quickly. So this Harling that is on the building now, this lovely white stuff, had some cement in it, which made it set quickly enough, but also began the problem because the cement then makes it very waterproof, which to begin with, again, is a great thing because it keeps the walls dry. But all around the edge, it tends to slightly shrink back because it's quite hard, and then the water gets in around the edges, and once it's got in behind this cement coat, it's like when you've been running with a plastic raincoat on or something. You're wet inside as well as outside. So the moisture had all got behind this. So we were anticipating that when this came off, there would be problems inside because the stone underneath doesn't like having water held against it. So that tells you all about, that was the sort of technical problems. Now there's all sorts of other interesting things about the building that you have to take into consideration. This is a very old Slazer view of Dunblane, and what it looks like. In some of the old writings, it says that Viscount Strathallan, who lived across the road from the library, when the money was left, he allowed some of his men to be used to gather stones, apparently from ruins that were something to do with the ruins around the abbey, or the cathedral, rather. Oops, I keep pressing the wrong button here. Get this right one. I think you can see in there, somewhere in there, we think is the site of the library. It's hard to tell which of the ruins would have been the ones they might have taken stone from, but we know that somewhere in there they were getting the stone, and somewhere in there, one of those buildings, I think, is probably the basis for what the library was built on. And this is one of the old maps where you can see where the library is sitting in there. I can't see it very well from my side, but hopefully you can see it from your side of the screen. We went through quite a lot of old maps to try and work out what was joined onto the library, and at different periods it seems to have had different things joined onto it. But what you mostly see is that, supposing you're standing in the street looking at the front of it, on the right-hand side when it was built, the building was still there. So it was built up against something. It was not only built on a bit of vault that was already there, it was built up against another building. And this is obviously much more recent, but it's just before the jail was knocked down, or the prison, or whatever it was. And it shows, I think you can see very faintly, an old doorway built up in brickwork. So, what we had to do was put together all the information about the technical problems we were trying to solve, of taking off the hard harling, pointing up the building, getting it all wind and watertight, in with all the other features of it. For example, you can see the little pink mark, which is the building. It literally stands on its own footprint. It has no ground around it. So you're entirely dependent on your neighbours for maintenance and space to do maintenance and building work. And then it's in a conservation area, so you're going to need planning consent, plus it's listed, and it's listed Category A, so you're going to need listed building consent. And because it's Category A, Historic Environment Scotland are going to be extra interested. And on top of all that, you've got this fantastic cartouche, which you obviously can't work on the building with that there. So from the beginning, that was going to have to be removed and taken away safely and conserved before it can be put back. So we put all this information together and also take into account, of course, that it's a library, so that when we finish, it still has to function as a library and have a good climate for keeping the books healthy. And the other interesting thing is that when you go up into the roof void, which is you have to go up a ladder, on the front side, it's quite interesting because the old sarking boards have been kept underneath the newer ones, and you can see little oak pegs where a slightly bigger size of slate, I think, has been on the roof, and people have taken the trouble to conserve that. So obviously we need to keep that as well. So all that information goes together and gets put into a scheme of a proposal for what's going to be done, which we had to have approved by the local authority in form of planning and listed building consent. It went to grant people. Obviously the client has to agree with it, and then we have to go to tender and get prices. And we actually went out to 4 contractors, all of whom we'd worked with before and who'd all done good stonework projects with us. And on this occasion, it was Gillis and Farrell who won, which I was particularly pleased about because the previous time we'd taken Harling off was off Roseburn House in Edinburgh, which is also a Grade A listed building. And it was Gillis and Farrell that did that there. So I knew that they would be good at facing up to what you find, because at Roseburn House we'd found 1 or 2 rather surprising things, you have far more surprising things here, as you're going to see. Now, the first thing we had to do before we could even get started was take the trees down, and we were lucky that the people in the manse were agreeable to us getting consent and removing the trees, because without that happening we couldn't get the scaffolding in to do the work. So this is the first picture of the library with the trees removed. And you can see now that other elevation that's really only ever seen from the manse garden, with the two lovely round-headed windows and a funny bit of extra thick wall at the bottom. Oh, and the other thing we had to do as we were preparing to get scaffolding up was we had to start looking for suitable stone and suitable slates for the repairs. So you can see over there, that's the pinkish stone on the windowsill of one of the windows, and that was one of the stones that we were considering. And what we did right at the start was we got the contractor to take off a bit of broken stone from one of the red details, and we got that analysed, and that stone sample is one of the ones that we were bringing to site as a result of that analysis to try and match it. And for the slates are a slightly greenish Scotch slate, and the contractor was able to source some really quite good matching second-hand Scotch slate, which is ready stored for use when we get onto the roof. Now, with the scaffolding up, this is when you really begin to find out if what you were hoping to find is there. And this is the chimney on the south end. And you can see, well, I don't know if you can quite make out, but what we did was we numbered all the stones, and then the contractor puts the same numbers onto them, so that then when the chimney needs to be taken down, which you can see by these huge gaps, because the stones have obviously moved over the years, so this chimney was to be taken down, and all the stones are numbered, so you can set them aside, in a safe place, arranged to get replacements, because there were 2 or 3 on the inside face that were really badly eroded. And then when he builds it back together, all the stones go back into exactly the same position. Because it's an important part when you're working on an old building and you're doing repair work. You don't want to lose any of the interesting features that you've discovered or any of its character, because you really want to save that so that the next generation can see exactly what it should be like. So this is what we were really pleased to see. It's quite hard to make. Oh. Dearie me. Quite hard to make out, but I'll get the right button in a minute. You can see there, those are the tails of the original crow steps on the south elevation. And the amazing thing about them is that they're red, which we never anticipated, because the crow steps at the other end are sort of buff-coloured. And the other thing about these is they're a little bit bigger. So you must conclude that they built the crow steps at either end at different times from one another. If we move on, these are those big vent openings. If you're standing down at the High Street end and you look up, there's 2 big rectangular openings with louvers in them. And what we think is that was for taking the air in, so that the atmosphere in the library was kept right. Really from the early stages, I think that they were determined to keep the atmosphere correct for the books. But the surprising thing about these is these great big stones up the side, which were all hidden underneath this thick white cementy harling. And these stones, when sandstone's laid down, it's laid down in layers, because it's sand, literally sand, laying down to make the rock. And when you're building with it, normally you place the stones in the same way, because that way they're strongest. But for some reason, I suppose because they couldn't get big enough bits, they chose to put these ones up on end. And the drawback with that is that when the water gets in and erodes them, you can see in there they're eroding right away at the edges. So there was then a tremendous opportunity for even more water to get in. And I think you can begin to see the condition of the stonework there, actually. That the stonework has really suffered from being underneath this cementy harling, because what happens when the water is held against the stones, they gradually lose the air in them. The stonework normally has sort of air in it that repels the water, but over time the water begins to replace air, so the stones actually become quite sodden wet, really, and then that's when the water begins to drift through into the inside of your building. So this was another interesting thing that we found on the south elevation, and this was half anticipated and half not. At the bottom of the wall, there was evidence of a window, and when the harling came off, it actually pulled off the stones that had been, or some of the stones that had been packed in to fill it in. So this little window, you can see that's the top of it, and that's the bottom of it, had been not properly built up. It was like just stuff had been packed into it and then sort of cemented over, which was surprising, because on the inside, this is what it looks like on the inside. So we thought there might be something there, but we were expecting just to see a sort of vague sign of a window, not an actual window opening like that. Now, this is us inside the Undercroft, looking at the back of that window, and you can see this is where it must be. So you see the little stones above the window on the inside, and actually, if you can make out, have I got the right way around here? No, I'm back to front. These are little fireplace ones, and I think that's our window over that side. As I'm reading the slides back to front here. Now, this is us moving on to the north end. Now, the north end chimney, you'll see, is totally different from the one at the south end. It's built in these tiny little stones, and it's obviously been built and rebuilt several times, because there was bits of brick and bits of all sorts, and, odd big stones and on here a strange sort of scarcement. Now, that's on the outside of the gable. And now, if you were inside a roof space, you'd expect to see that, but you're not. You're outside on the gable. And then, of course, you think, well, that's correct, because we know that the library was built up against, I think it was called the Dean's Manse or something. So what we've got there is actually the inside wall of the adjacent building has just been left to become the outside wall of the library. And then when they started to take that chimney down to rebuild it, they discovered something even more unexpected, and that is this carved stone with initials on it, which has the initials of, I think it's a former bishop or something. Someone will remember the name of him. But it struck me that because of this angle on it, it's probably been off the top of a dormer window. So what we wondered is if the next door house had dormer windows in it, when it was then demolished and the end of the library was altered because this building next door had been demolished, did someone deliberately put that stone in there, either as a memorial or just as something that they were hoping someone would find later on? It's quite intriguing. So this is a completely different house in South Queensferry. I just happened to be passing and I thought, you know, that is exactly the sort of thing I was thinking of when I saw that stone. I thought, I just wonder if the house next door was just a little bit like that, and it's one of these stones. But I don't know if we'll ever find out for sure, or if that's just a guess. Now, this is the work on the north gable, because the north gable really was in a much poorer condition than you might have expected, and I think that's largely because it had never been built as an outside wall. It had been an inside wall on both sides, because what it looks as though the Dean's house, which would have been built on further to the north, actually extended further along to where the library now is, and at some point something was changed and just the vault was left to build off. So this particular wall, which was really intended to be an inside wall, has ended up as an outside wall, and that accounts for the really surprisingly small and poor condition of the stonework. And then, because it had had all this harling over it, trapping the moisture in, the pointing between the stones was completely just worn away. It came away in your hand like dust once you got this really hard coating off the front. And you can see the crow steps with the line across them there, the line from where the harling, the bit that was harled, and the other part of the crow steps, which you can see they're quite small, buff-coloured ones. And then the other interesting thing is at this level, and I've put black arrows on it. Let's see if I can get this one to show it as well. But that there and there is a fireplace. But it's not a fireplace for the library, it's a fireplace for the house that was joined on, and that rather surprised us, because for some reason I was still imagining in my mind that the Flues were going to be serving fireplaces in the library. But of course they never did. There must have been a fireplace there, a fireplace further down, and probably one at the very bottom on that side. So that's a close-up of the fireplace. So you can see it's even got soot in it, as though it's been used. And down here, which is on the floor, would have been on the floor below, that's like a press in the wall. And there were more stones. There were more stones in there, but they were so loose that they came out. And that in behind there is actually the plaster that is still surviving. So, you know, it slows you down. That's the trouble. It slows you down when you find all these things, because we were expecting to find one or two, but not so many, and not such complicated things, which then take a bit more care to put right, because obviously they'll have to be carefully filled back in and harled over, and it goes back to being a gable wall. But because we found so much of interest, and part of the consent for planning and listing was that if you happen to find anything interesting, you must record it. We've been recording things, just far more things than anyone ever imagined could happen in such a small building. Now, yeah, these are two other interesting ones, because these are kind of corroborating the theory that the other building joined on. Because if you look at, point to the right one this time, that is the outside wall. And the way that is, and the way that little joint is running up, you think that outside wall has carried on all the way up the street. It's been there as a continuous wall. And then when they've taken the neighbour down, they've taken the neighbour down, and they haven't really finished it off. They've just faced it over. And at this side, this is the other side of that gable, looking at it from the garden, you can see these are the really thin stones that have been kind of stuck onto the face of the north gable. Again, with surprising gaps. So it proves, I think it proves the theory about the sequence of building, but it also gives new headaches to the contractor for how to put in extra stones, and we're probably going to put in some extra stainless steel mesh in the joints to make sure the whole thing ties together a lot more soundly than it is at present. Now this takes us on to the windows. Now the windows are interesting as well because, and it's quite hard to see on the photos, but I'll try and point to them. If you can make out, there's a slightly different character between these stones and the ones at the top. And what we think, when you read a bit of the history of the library, at a point towards it was in the Georgian era, so that makes it probably either the late 1790s or 1813 or something like that. There were plans to raise the ceiling and slightly rearrange the interior. And what we think was when they raised the ceiling, I think they raised the window heads. And I think probably the original windows were rectangular, just with a straight head on them there. So these top stones are the reddish stone with lovely fine joints, and then the lower down stones, I suppose because they've been there longer, are actually in quite a poor condition. And this window along at this end, this is the south-facing window, and I think because that one gets the weather from the southwest, that's really quite eroded in at the edges and quite badly worn. So we've got a little schedule of all the stones that are having to be replaced. Every one of these stones has its own individual number, and we've been around working out just exactly which ones have to be completely replaced, which ones you could perhaps replace just part. And this brings us down to, this is the bottom of the wall that faces into the manse garden, and this has this strange thickening of the wall, and we'd been told at the start that it was called a blast wall because it was put there during the war to make it into a bomb shelter. But when you take the thick harling off, you can see that that's a much older wall. And I think probably it's more to do with when the ground levels changed, because that's another thing you notice, that in the front and behind the library there's quite a big level difference now, which I don't think there was in the past. So I think at some point when the manse, the Church of Scotland manse, as opposed to the Dean's manse, was built further back in the garden, I think the ground levels were altered, and that probably accounts for the reason why they brought this wall face forward, perhaps to make it better, perhaps to damp-proof it, and perhaps to protect the library from the garden ground that they were bringing up. But this is the thing that I think has the World War II connection, because this door has been all replaced with strong brickwork all around it on the inside. So I think that would have been done when this was then used as a bomb shelter. So these are just some more shots, really just to show you what lovely stonework it is, but in what a terrible condition it is. Because these are the big coin stones down on the south corners, which you need to look at in the daylight, because, I mean, they're beautiful big stones. And this is some of the walling, just crying out for it to be completely repointed. Now, we haven't actually started on the roof yet. The roof, you can see here, these are the crow steps. That's the one that was red. And this is looking along the ridge of the roof. You can see a little wiggle in it. And you can see that the slates are quite small, and they're in what's called diminishing courses, where there are bigger ones at the bottom and they work up to smaller ones at the top. But what we've got to do is finish the work on the chimneys first, and then they can adjust the scaffolding to get onto the roof. You actually get quite a good view of the little building across the road as well. So here we are now down in the Undercroft. That's the inside face of that World War II, as I think, door. This is us looking out of the entrance into the street, and that's looking towards the bricked up door. And you can see, you can't see it so well in this one. It was the earlier Undercroft photo I showed. There's a slight joint in the ceiling of the Undercroft, and that's where I think the new part was joined onto the old vault. And here we are again with the doors. Now that's the door into the library, which before the Harling was taken off, of course, looked like a simple little thing. But now there you are, you can see the lovely relieving arch above it. And then this is the infilled brick one that's been uncovered. It's in two parts because it's all in amongst the scaffolding at the minute. You can see the little tiny worn out lintel that there is up there. And the stones have been packed with, where they've worn away, they've been packed with tiles or something. That's the inside of that door. So that's another, fascinating feature that we've spent a bit of time thinking about. Oops. And this is us back on the outside, on the upper side, and this is the cartouche, and this is its surround. And what you can see there, oh dear. There we are. What you can see there is those stones were replaced at some point in the past. And they didn't do it quite right because it's the wrong colour of stone and the shape isn't quite right. And I think I had a previous slide. This is what the stonemason's been doing, setting it out on the floor on a big piece of paper and trying to get exactly the right moulding to fit it in and exactly the right arch. Because what we're going to do is we're going to replace those top stones. And when we were just, before this meeting, we were just talking, I was just speaking to Graciela about, I don't know how they got those stones in, because there's no evidence that they removed the cartouche to do that back in the 1980s or the 1920s or whenever they did it. So I don't know how they slipped them in without damaging anything. So we're going to put that right now that we get full access to it, and we're going to get proper stones, correct colour, get the curve right, and make that all ready for the cartouche to come back. And that was pretty much sums up all the issues we've had. And the only thing I would add is that it's a real collaboration that you have to make something like this work. You know, we've had a QS helping us with figures, we've got specialists helping with the cartouche, and the contractor, of course, is absolutely fundamental to the success of something like this, because you really depend on the guys on site and their skill and experience, taking it apart carefully enough not to harm things and then putting it all back together again. So it's been a real team effort. And I'll leave you with this picture because that even has the neighbours in it. Thank you very much.
And that's all there is to it. And so our project originally was scheduled for 16 weeks. It's now running at 48 weeks. And I hope you can see the reasons for it. So the main thing is that from our point of view, we're very happy that the contractors and the professionals we're engaging are really very good at what they do, and we're doing a proper job. There's no bodging going on here. But it's lengthy and it is expensive. Now, our final speaker, looking forward to this, is Graciela Ainsworth, who is a well-known person in sculpture circles in Scotland. And she has been commissioned to restore the cartouche, which, again, like the rest of the building, was not half as simple as we hoped it would be. So, Graciela, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alistair. And again, as Rosalind said, thank you very much for coming. I hope you can hear me talking. I've never spoken in such an incredible space before. I mean, I feel very, very honoured even just to be speaking. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I mean, I'm just talking at the end on a tiny, tiny part of this wonderful building. But I mean, from all the things that Rosalind was describing of the whole building, there's still a huge amount, even in something so small and extremely beautiful. So I'd like to start by saying the very first time we were asked to look at the cartouche was back in 2011, and it was just on that wee ladder. So, you know, it was just, I think we were being teased a little bit by seeing, you know, what there was there, but not enough that I could actually really get my teeth into. And it's not just me, I have to say. I've got a wonderful team, so it's always teamwork. So I'd like to then talk about when I was actually first asked to go up. We built a tower scaffold, temporary scaffold, and it was the first time I would actually get my hands on this wonderful piece. And it was just starting to try and understand how on earth is this really fine piece of marble, definitely marble, in Scotland, outside. Marble does not like being in Scotland, outside, I can assure you. But this one was a lot better from the front anyway than I ever would have imagined. But saying that, what I was needing to do was to do a report, and in that report I was going to be recommending what I felt was necessary for the object, to save the object for the future, and I had to think what was most appropriate, but also so much of its, particularly how it was built, is completely hidden. And I'd never worked on a marble monument on the outside of a building like this. So I had to imagine what the problems may be. I had a handheld metal detector. That was very useful. So first of all, I could see that the amazing mitre, which actually is really, really fine, beautifully carved all the way up there. You can't see it. And I'm sorry that you can't see it, because just even the mitre is really beautifully carved. But what I could see immediately was there's an area here of the marble cartouche that had become lost and fallen, oopsie daisy, and had fallen away, and that was because there was a great big rusty ferrous fixing. It looked like a really, really early fixing, but it was corroding. So whether that was a fixing from the mitre to the cartouche or through the cartouche, I had no idea, but I could see that it was actually creating problems. Even in that photograph, I don't know if you can see that the mitre actually stands forward and there's a gap behind it. So it's a really unusual construction of several elements. So anyway, at this point, I wrote a report, documented what I could see, what issues there were, what might be hidden within it, and then put costs together for everything, including all the hidden items. So what I wanted to just quickly say is that monuments of this importance, I've only ever seen inside. So I thought I'd show you just two of which are actually of the same date as the Leighton Library cartouche, one by Grinling Gibbons. The middle one, sort of, there's something I feel is similar. There's something about that I feel is similar in the carvings to the Leighton Library one. But sadly, I rang at Richmond Church and they don't know, interestingly, 1687, and they don't know who carved that one either, because they don't know who carved this one. and I thought I had it. I thought nearly, maybe I've got it. I was going to rush down to Richmond and have a look at this one, try and find initials or everything. Well, the church said, sadly, they don't know who carved that one yet. This is what I believe, yet. And then another one, we were working in St. Michael's Belfry in York, of which there are amazing carvers in York at that time. This one's later, mind you, but it has a winged skull at the bottom, which your Leighton Library has a separate, exquisitely, beautifully carved skull as well, winged skull. But what I also wanted to mention briefly was the only paintwork visible on these three particularly is the heraldic shields. And although there's documentation here from Edward Lightmaker and Lord Strathallan of the time when this cartouche was brought potentially from London up to Scotland and built in, there doesn't seem to be also any records of his coat of arms, if he had one. There's a seal, and so the trust had got the Lord Lion of Scotland to go to research whether he could find his coat of arms, and together with the seal and some other sources, they found that that there was a piece of heraldry, which is argent, a lion salient, gules, armed and langed or, which actually means, briefly, that the background is argent, which is silver. Oopsie daisy. The main figure within the shield is a lion. Salient is a bit like rampant, where the lion's feet are on the ground and the paws are up. And then it said gules, so he was painted red. And the lion is armed and langed or. I'm not saying this probably right. But anyway, armed means his claws and langed is his tongue. And the Lord Lion has suggested that the lion had gilded claws and a gilded tongue. And interestingly, on the Grinling Gibbons, which I was really, really hoping that somehow there might be something somewhere saying maybe this winged skull was carved by Grinling Gibbons. I think that's probably not going to happen, but who knows? Who knows? But funnily enough, on that Grinling Gibbons cartouche, part of that heraldry is that exact half of it is a very similar piece of heraldry. So I'll move on. So this was the day when we actually we were lucky enough, privileged to get the commission, and this is when we started. So 2022, first things first, we get scaffold built with the important running beam, because of course the scaffold's there for us to work on, but also to get the cartouche down, however we're going to do that. So even at this point, we're designing, we had to get a really small scaffold built against the building, definitely not drilled into the building, be respectful of this building. But we also were told that we needed to keep the scaffold itself, the feet, as close to the building as possible, just on the pavement, hardly on the road. So what we would want to have done in a perfect world, it sort of makes sense, really, it's common sense, is that you have the cartouche and you think, okay, I'll sling it up and then I'll bring it forward, straight out of the niche, because it's set in the niche. You want to just bring it straight forward. So therefore you'd have the running beam right in front of it. Unfortunately, we couldn't do that. So that's another challenge. We had to have the running beam parallel to the building. And this is how we started it. We started at the top, and we thought, well, that one fixing I could see was the one between the mitre and the top of the shield. So first of all, we had to take away, it's got brown cement behind the shield. So this brown cement actually hid anything that we could imagine of how it was fixed. So first of all, we carefully took the brown cement away from the top, and we cut through, documenting all the way, cut through the fixing that was holding the mitre, and we got the mitre off. So the mitre went down, safe and sound. But oh no, there was another fixing behind. Hidden behind that mitre was another fixing, which was set into the top of the shield and connecting that to the back of the wall. Now, you couldn't see that, so we had no idea. Anyway, this we also cut. But what I forgot to say, what I should have done, was when we first went up and we had all the scaffold erected, we initially put in 2 eye bolts to either side of the cartouche, very important that I omitted, to either side of the cartouche into the back of the niche, and had a ratchet strap. So we actually had fail-safes on the actual build, on the cartouche ourselves, and we also had it slung and connected to the running beam with a block and tackle. So just so that you know that we had already secured it ourselves, knowing exactly what we've done before we started taking it apart, cutting fixings, as we didn't actually know how it was fixed. But this is part of our job, and this is what we love, because you're learning, and you're learning how somebody else thought about. You're having to try and think, well, how would they think how they were going to build it in? Oh, dear me, sorry, keeping with my hands about. And there's Tom Asprey from the who's his wonderful photographs. He was there right at the beginning, documenting as we worked. And I had to put in Liam, the scaffolder, because even though we thought we had the running beam in the right place, when we started taking the fixings apart, we then had to think, okay, we're going to have to move the running beam further into the road so that we had slightly more give on the block and tackle. So the scaffold had to be changed slightly, and he's brilliant and very sensitive, and we work with him all the time. And had to do the same thing in the Portrait Gallery in Edinburgh. So this is where we're slowly taking more and more of the cement away, and we found 2 fixings to either side of the cartouche. So we thought, okay, this is what we've seen before. We'll cut both of those, and then, oh no, I must stop waving my arms around. Sorry, it's getting too exciting. Cut both fixings out, and then you think, okay, I've cut the top fixing, I've cut the 2 side ones, it's going to come out. No, it didn't. So everything's all in place, you've still got it on the block and tackle, it's safe and sound. You know, there was just the 3 of us at that point, Jonathan, Ian and I, and so we were cutting round, trying to work out trying to work out how have they done this. But you could just get round the back, and you could see not only had they put the fixings, well, we thought at that time, we still didn't know how it was fixed behind it, but they'd even built the stonework, and it was all lime mortar at the back. They'd even, the form behind the cartouche, they'd even thought about that. So we couldn't wiggle it because there was no space behind. We thought, we'd be able to rock it. No. They'd even filled all back behind the shield really beautifully with, they never wanted this cartouche to leave the building. They really, really didn't. And that also, then, this was really, really important at that time. They went down to London, they got one of the best, a really good piece of marble. They obviously had great sculptors, and they had great craftspeople right here building it into the building. I mean, I would have preferred know what I was doing, but it was, we were respecting the work had been done, was really brilliant. But we had to get it out, and we had to do it really carefully. And so we cut through. There's also a fixing between the cartouche. So the piece is made of mitres separate, the cartouche, then there's the winged skull, beautiful wings. Oh my goodness, that skull is amazing. The winged skull, it's lower down, so actually you can maybe get with binoculars. I think you have to, binoculars, and really, it's just so beautifully carved. That was low down, so we'd cut through that. So thank goodness it just started moving, and we were able to just really slowly move it out. And just, I don't know, a minute, if I can I? Oh no, it doesn't. Oh well. That's a little tiny little video of how slow it was taking it down as well. Really important. But the main thing was, what we found when we took it out was this. This there and here are two U's. And they were set into the back of the cartouche. And they had a great big metal bar. Really, really, obviously the metal at that time was really good, but nonetheless, ferrous and corroding, sadly, but it was a great big long bar. It wasn't two small fixings on either side, which is what I presumed. It was a great big long bar, over a metre, that was possibly, I mean, somehow, I actually don't, I'm still working out, I was talking to Rosalind, how they built it in originally, that they, putting it into such a small space. I mean, we were using a reciprocating saw. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's basically a saw that holds a blade that's only like about 2 mil, 3 mil thick. And that's all really we could get between the cartouche and the frame. So we really had very little space to cut those dowels, really. And the fact they got it in, and they got this great big 1 metre bar into behind a moulding on one side and into the other one. Really clever. But we got it out. We got it out. And down, very safely. Oh, there you go. That was an accident. You can just about see the hooks on the back as it's coming down. But it's slow. Okay, that was probably enough. The shield now, cartouche, is now safely on our bogie at ground level on blankets. There's the long bar that was put into the what is it, the crypt, the undercroft. Then we're taking out this amazing winged skull and the block. That was difficult to get out. There wasn't a single fixing holding that into the building, weirdly. But the cartouche was sitting on that block. There was no damage on the actual marble cartouche. I mean, there was old weathering, just weathered damage, but there was no, I mean, it's had, potentially, that great big cartouche sitting on it since 1687. I mean, well, with a great big bar and everything else, but nonetheless, I mean, really a great feat of engineering. So it's now in the workshop. Most of it was in the workshop. The one thing we'd left on site still to take out, which two of the team went up there and spent a day doing, was to get the fixing that I told you about that was hidden behind the mitre. And we thought, it'll be easy. It'll just be a little short, totty one, just sort of going into the stonework behind. How wrong were we? Oh, no. That, 530, that's half a metre in the wall. You couldn't see any of it. I mean, I don't think they needed that much. I really, really don't. 200 mil would have been fine, 530 mil. But we were determined to get it out. And I was a little worried that we might have gone through the wall on the inside. We didn't. But it was diagonally up. But that was potentially, because this is all really, the original, I think this is original, that was just below the stonework that Rosalind was talking about that had been replaced in the 30s? No, possibly in the 30s. So that, I mean, in the 30s, they took out some stone with all of this still there, and that blooming great big long 530 bar fixing, and they managed to put stone back in again with just that mitre sitting there. I mean, that is incredible also. So everyone has been so careful and thoughtful. So what we've been doing is taking out all these fixings. All the fixings are ferrous. All of them have been set in with lead. And even what was lovely was, I know it's because I do it. I absolutely love this. It might not be as interesting to everybody, but it is interesting. Sorry, it is interesting. The tool marks, when they've been finishing the lead, they've poured the lead in, molten lead, right? And then they finish it off by using a chisel and a hammer just to flatten it. The same chisel marks were in the back of the fixing between the block and the winged skull, as they were around there. So definitely the same hand, same person, put in those fixings, which is there and there, as did this great big huge fixing. I've no idea why that was so big, but nonetheless it's definitely the same hand. I mean, again, it'd be interesting to analyse the metal, but we've got every single bit, and we will be presenting it to the Trust. It's a great record. I mean, fixings from that time, really, really interesting. But what we also found, the back of the cartouche. I didn't know what I'd find. I actually thought it would be really, really disaggregated. When you find a marble monument, even within a damp mausoleum, practically always, they look perfect on the outside, like absolutely the day they were made. And you just start tapping them, and they're hollow because they've deteriorated. Oh, no, not again. Sorry. And they've deteriorated from the back. So you think they're solid, but they're actually really not. And that is a problem even with a marble monument inside with damp. This one, actually, the marble is incredibly solid, except for it's got major fractures. And you see how close these big fractures were to the big fixings. So it was a really good time to take it down. But there's also sulfation on there. And I could see that there was a lot of very fine fractures around all the edges where there was loss. And so the next phase, just cleaning it, just lessening the sulfation. So it's not over-cleaning it, it's keeping the history and the patina that's of the monument, but it's lessening the sulfation, because like taking the cement off a building, it does the same thing. It creates an impervious layer, and it can't breathe. So I was doing in a tent inside the workshop, all blacked out so that the laser couldn't penetrate. Laser cleaning with it's a lovely compact Phoenix laser that we hire. We don't own, we just hire it for the occasion project. And you can see here, that's the back of the shield, the cartouche, and this is the thick sulfation crust before I started. This is it before I started. You can't really read the foliage, but I could see that there were fissures. There were fissures there. So this is when I finished. But even at this point, this is interesting in itself, but also it helps you read the object. And look at that. It's just so exquisite and delicate, that mitre. Now, I haven't taken very much off. I've just lightly cleaned the sulfation layer. That's all I did. But what's interesting about the mitre is that it's got that slightly ochre hue to it. And once you start understanding the object and looking at it, you think, okay, well, that must have been gilded, because that is where the oil size has penetrated the marble and it's discoloured it. So, well, this is what you think. This is what I through experience, I feel that's why that's slightly more yellow, because it has been gilded in the past. And And hopefully you can start to see this. It's so very beautiful. It really, really is. There's drill marks right through where all anatomically really correct. So we document, obviously, as you can see, there's lots of photographs. We've got lots of photographs. We're documenting it constantly because it's a learning process. We've got to learn ourselves about your object. So this is just a drawing where we're marking on all the different bits of damage. That damage through weathering, mostly, and the top one where it's the ferrous fixing, potentially. But then as I was looking at the drapery section, I thought, what is all of that? I think it was shot. I might be wrong. But there's little circular divots, some of them pretty perfect. And it's not drill marks, and what would you be doing up there with it? You know, it's not from a pointing machine. So I don't know. It would be really interesting to find out. Somebody could see. I started then researching lead shot, which is a very unusual thing I haven't done before. But, you know, why it could have been. But then, of course, I was looking at little divots in here, and then you find something similar in there, which was actually behind some of the foliage. So once we'd lessened the sulfation, these things started appearing. Now, I know 100% what that is. They're drill marks from the original carver. The carver was they're carving these fine bits of foliage, and they want to undercut it. So by undercutting, the simplest thing, and it's what we do now, it's what I do now if I'm carving, you drill underneath. It saves you, if you can't get a chisel in, it's the easiest way of doing it. But there it is. That is, you want to find original tool marks. It'd be lovely to find a signature, but we didn't find a signature, sadly. But we found that they're definitely original drill marks from the sculptor. Aha, there. Well, you see, once you start working, you just think, well, really, the part of the project that could go on that could be carried out in the future for funds was pigment analysis, because I could see right the first time I looked at it, there's definitely layers of paint on there. And it's been recorded in the trust meeting papers that it was painted in around mid-1700s. It was probably really well scrubbed and painted, all the original paint, most of the original paint off, painted up again, and then in the 1800s, the same again. At least twice. There might have been a lot more than that. And of course, I can't help, we can't help it. You're excited, you want to learn more and more from this object. And when I was doing the laser cleaning, I thought, that's a bit of pale blue. What is a piece of pale blue doing in the eye socket of the winged skull? What is it doing? Why is that there? And I just don't... well, I've never seen a pale blue painted skull, but I don't know. But then I found blue in some of the drapery. So we couldn't help it. We got the microscope, the handheld microscope out, and we started looking. And then we found this. Look at this is just a handheld microscope. So when we weren't doing analysis and not under full microscope, which we could have done, but and we documented. We've actually taken a few little tiny samples, documented it, and photographs. And this one actually is on the mitre. So they've got the same blue on the mitre, the skull, and the drapery. So then I thought, well, maybe they painted the whole building with a lime wash with blue in it, because they did at some point, and then it's just splashed, which it couldn't be helped, little tinies, but it's actually really interesting. So, I'm being naughty because it just means that whenever there is funds for analysis, when the cartouche goes back on the wall, somebody can go up there really easily, take little samples, and actually there's so much more to learn. And then, am I okay for time, actually? Sorry. Okay. And then I was going to say, right, well, we're working on the mitre, and there's something sparkly with the Dynalite microscope, aha, is it gold? No, it wasn't. It's fool's gold. It was actually a natural inclusion in the marble, and that's actually iron pyrite, but of course it's fool's gold. But then not much further round, we actually did find real gold. So definitely, this mitre was gilded. At what point? This will be probably the most recent gilding, but, you know, that's going to say potentially that there has been, oh no, I'm really sorry, a lot of gilding in the past, potentially. Then, as I say, I am really interested. I really want to find out as much as possible and help and give information. So I started really looking through lots of different carvers at that time in London. And there were actually lots of carvers. There's William Stanton, there's, and his foliage, you know, if you look at the foliage, they're actually a little bit similar to the foliage in the, you know, it's just things start getting closer. There's also Edward Pearce, and that, how wonderful is that monument, with a skull. Now, the skull's not the same, but he did a lot of skull. He's obviously skulls, the drapery, the way that the knots are made, just the forms. You know, somebody definitely will be able to, I believe, if they look enough through all the monuments, find out. I mean, the skull, I still couldn't find one that was, pardon me, really close to that. But also at that time, I was reading, and it's what we do now. It's the same. You have a workshop, you do some carving, but you will get somebody else in to do something, some part of it. Maybe you're busy doing 2 or 3 pieces of work, and you need someone to carve that skull, and you know that other carver you know would be brilliant at doing that. And that's what they did then. It's the same. So it could be different hands, which is also really interesting and I think quite possible. Okay, the last slide. And this is just the story of the cartouche so far, because this is as it is at the moment, and it looks so magnificent and beautiful. And as a conservator, I have to say, I feel like I should be saying it's got to go inside. It's really, really got to go inside. But the other part of me is going, yes, but actually, look, they got such a great piece of marble. It actually has a lot of more years. It can be outside for a few more years. I'm not saying indefinitely, but it can be outside. It can. But it's got to go back into these spaces. How on earth are we going to do that? So we're designing, going to work with the main contractor and design something, that is simpler to take out again. And it will be really well documented. And it will be within this Leighton Library. That document will be here for the future, for the next time when I'm afraid almost certainly that cartouche will have to go inside. But it's got a home to go inside too. So, but it will, 100% will have to at some point. But I just want to say thank you, because we're custodians of this wonderful piece to hold it for the future, and it's incredible that it's in a building that's being looked after for the future, and that building is looking after books for the future. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much, Graciela. Absolutely fascinating. So that's the end of our presentations. I'd just like to ask the Chair of Trustees of the Leighton Library, Colin Rennick, to come up and close our proceedings. Thank you.
Had I known that I was going to end up as the minister in Dunblane Cathedral, and with the Leighton Library in the corner of my garden, I would have paid far more attention to the lectures on that period of Scottish church history when I was a student in Aberdeen. Because the senior lecturer in Scottish church history at the time, Henry Sefton, had himself been minister at Newbattle. And he developed through that experience and his passion for Scottish church history, a very, very deep respect for Robert Leighton. And I really wish in those muggy Thursday afternoons in lecture rooms in Aberdeen University I hadn't dozed off. Because Leighton, it was impressed on us even then, was a remarkable man. A man who could see both points of view in a deeply divided church during turbulent times. A man with a very peaceable and pastoral heart and a scholar's mind. And my respect for Leighton and the building and the library has grown ever since. When I first came to Dunblane on many occasions to various Royal School of Church Music events and various things in Scottish Church's House, I was vaguely aware of this, dare I say it, slightly grotty building that was the Leighton Library, and it always seemed to be shut when I was around. And like many people, that one of these days I must go and visit that. I'm sure it might be quite interesting, but it looked pretty unprepossessing at the time. I was bowled over when I first saw it. And nobody ever told me, of course, when I was appointed as minister here, that I would end up as the chairman of the Leighton Library Trustees. And when we first met, we discussed painting the building. And we discussed what sort of paint we would use, and dare I say it, how little we needed to spend on it. Boy, am I glad that we didn't go down that route, because I have this nightmare scenario of a shell of Harling standing there with no building left inside it. This project has been a remarkable one, and it's the product of a lot of commitment and love and care and professionalism by so many people. The contractors who have impressed me with their workmanship and their demeanour and their friendship, they're good to have around. The architect, the surveyors, Graziella's passion. I'll never look at a winged skull in the same light ever again. And I shall study them minutely to see if they've got blue eye sockets. And the trustees, and on the trustees' behalf, I thank the whole team who've been involved in this very remarkable work. The executive has worked tirelessly over many, many hours bringing this project to the point it's at now, and we've got much further to go, and, as has been pointed out at the beginning, much, much more to spend. We're in this, we've got to go the full course now and finish the job, but it's such an important job, and it's been impressed on us just how important this library is. When the Historic Scotland architect came to do an initial survey on the building, Jamie McPherson, I took him into the library and he walked in and he looked around and said, "Wow." And it wasn't just the building that fascinated him, fascinating though it was and is. It was the fact that it still had the books, Bishop Leighton's books, for which it had been built. And that, from his point of view as a conservation architect and an architect working for a grant-awarding body, made it such a fascinating and worthwhile project. And it excited and enthused him, as I hope it excites and enthuses so many of us. So thank you for coming out today, this evening in such numbers and showing your support and enthusiasm. And I expect fully to see a crowded library when it reopens. I hope to see many more volunteers, because the future of the library does depend on it being able to open, and to open it has to have a sizable number of volunteers to share this treasure with people from this community and indeed all over the world. So thank you to all who have been involved, and I do commend it to your time and your generosity, and I expect to see you standing across the road with your binoculars, studying the crow steps and the slates, and above all the cartouche. So thank you for tonight, for your interest, and I do commend this to your support as you're able to give it, because it is a treasure of which I think Dunblane should be rightly proud, and worth preserving, worth celebrating, worth developing, because there's an Undercroft there that has potential to be so much more, and to make this library so much more accessible in the 21st century to many people. So thank you all very much, and thank you especially to our team of professionals and to our executive for their incredible hard work. Thank you.